Ethan had never believed in urban legends. He had spent his whole life debunking ghost stories, laughing at people who feared the things lurking in the dark. But that was before he saw something he couldn't explain. Before he entered Ashwood Hollow, it started with a road trip, a weekend getaway with his friends, heading to the mountains of Oregon for some fresh air, far away from the city. They followed the GPS, trusting the winding highways to lead them to their rental cabin. But somewhere along the way, the map changed. The road signs no longer made sense. The exits led to places that weren't on any map, and when they tried to turn back, the road looped. Again and again, until they saw the sign, "Welcome to Ashwood Hollow." The letters were faded, the wood cracked and rotting. The sign looked old, too old. And behind it, a town that shouldn't be there. Small wooden houses lined the quiet streets, their windows dark, their doors closed. The air was too still, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The sun, once bright overhead, had dimmed into a strange pale gray, casting everything in an eternal dusk. "Where the hell are we?" Ryan muttered from the passenger seat. Ethan didn't answer, because something about Ashwood Hollow felt wrong. They pulled into an empty gas station. The pumps were rusted, covered in vines. The glass of the convenience store was cracked but not shattered, and inside, the shelves were full of untouched items. Everything was clean, preserved, as if someone had been expecting them. A bell chimed as they stepped inside. A man stood behind the counter, or at least something that looked like a man. His clothes were decades out of style, his skin too smooth, his expression eerily blank. Ethan cleared his throat. Hey, we just need directions. Our GPS is messed up." The man tilted his head. "Welcome home." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. "We're just passing through," Ryan added quickly. "We, got lost. Can you tell us how to get back to the highway?" The man behind the counter didn't blink. "You don't leave Ashwood Hollow." His voice was flat, distant, like a recording playing on repeat. Ryan forced a laugh. "Okay, man, weird joke. We'll just..." Then the lights flickered. For a split second, everything changed. The shelves were empty. The windows were boarded up. And behind the counter, the man had no face. Just a smooth, blank surface where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The lights flickered again. The store was normal. The man was watching them, smiling. Ethan grabbed Ryan's arm. "We need to go." They ran back to the car. But when they turned the keys, the engine was dead. And behind them, the man from the store was standing in the doorway, not moving, not blinking. And then, the town came to life. Figures stepped out of the houses, out of the shadows, out of the impossible darkness. All of them watching, all of them smiling. "You don't leave Ashwood Hollow." Their voices spoke in unison. Ryan tried his phone. No service. Ethan's pulse pounded. They were trapped, and the town was closing in. They ran, through the streets that twisted into impossible directions, through alleys that led nowhere. The town was shifting, changing. The houses stretched too tall. The streets cracked like dry skin. The sky darkened completely. Then they saw it, the forest at the edge of town, a place that felt even worse. But it was the only way out. They sprinted into the trees, and the town followed. The whispers grew louder. "You don't leave Ashwood Hollow." The figures moved too fast, their limbs bent the wrong way, their eyes too wide, their smiles too sharp. Ethan ran until his legs burned, until his lungs felt like they would collapse. Then silence. He turned. The town was gone. No streets, no houses, no people, only trees, only darkness, and something watching, waiting. A single voice, soft, behind him. "You brought it with you." Ethan turned, and something smiled in the dark. Then, everything went black. Ethan woke up in his bed. His heart hammered. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? His hands shook as he reached for his phone. No messages. No calls. No record of ever leaving for a road trip. But when he checked his car, his shoes, his clothes, they were covered in dirt. Forest dirt. His head spun. Then his phone buzzed. A message. Unknown number. "Welcome home, Ethan." His breath caught in his throat. He turned toward the mirror, and his reflection was smiling, even though he wasn't. Ethan had tried to forget Ashwood Hollow. For 3 weeks, he convinced himself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the mind, a stress-induced nightmare. But the problem wasn't forgetting. The problem was that Ashwood Hollow had not forgotten him. It followed him, in the static on his television, in the whispers behind closed doors, in the reflection in his bathroom mirror that sometimes didn't blink when he did, and worst of all, in the people he saw on the street. They weren't right. Some of them stood too still, watching him from the corners of their eyes. Others walked with movements too synchronized, as if they were pieces of the same being. And when he passed them, they smiled, too wide, too knowing, like they were waiting for something. Ethan's paranoia grew. He locked his doors at night, but still heard footsteps in his apartment. He turned on every light, but still saw shadows move where they shouldn't. And his phone never stopped buzzing. Always the same message. From an unknown number, "You don't leave Ashwood Hollow." At first, he deleted them. Then, he blocked the number. But the messages kept coming, appearing on his television, on his laptop screen. Once, they were scratched into the glass of his bedroom window. And still, every night, he dreamed of that town, of streets that stretched too long, of houses with doors that never opened, of figures standing in the forest, waiting, whispering. Ethan knew what it meant. It was calling him back, and soon he wouldn't have a choice. It happened on a Friday night. Ethan had been staring at his laptop, eyes burning from exhaustion. The screen glitched. A new message appeared. Time to come home. Then his power cut out. Total darkness. The air in his apartment shifted. He wasn't alone anymore. Ethan's breath was ragged. He reached for his phone, flicking on the flashlight, and nearly screamed, because standing just outside his bedroom door was a figure. Still, silent. Its face was smooth, featureless, but it was smiling. Ethan bolted for the front door. His fingers clawed at the locks, but the door wouldn't open. A whisper curled through the room. "You don't leave Ashwood Hollow." Then the walls changed. The apartment melted away. Wooden. And when Ethan turned around, he wasn't in his apartment anymore. He was standing on Main Street. In Ashwood Hollow, the town was exactly the same. The same empty houses, the same flickering streetlights, The same wrong sky, eternally stuck in gray dusk. And the people were there too, waiting, watching, smiling. Ethan took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. The road behind him was gone. The town had trapped him. Again, his stomach twisted. A single voice echoed through the street. "Welcome home." Then, the figures began to move. Slow, inhuman. Ethan ran through twisting alleys, past houses that seemed to shift when he looked away. But no matter where he went, the town stretched on forever, like a maze with no exit. And the worst part, the streets were changing, turning into something familiar, something impossible. They were turning into his neighborhood, his apartment building, his street. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. The town was becoming his world, replacing everything until there was nothing left, except Ashwood Hollow. Ethan woke up in his bed. The morning sun streamed through the window. Birds chirped outside. His phone sat on the nightstand. No messages, no missed calls. For the first time in weeks, everything seemed normal. Ethan let out a breath, rubbing his hands over his face. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? Then, his eyes drifted to his bedroom window, and his stomach dropped, because outside, the street wasn't his street anymore. The buildings weren't his buildings. It was Ashwood Hollow. His breath caught in his throat. His reflection in the window was smiling, even though he wasn't. Then, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You're finally home." And from outside, the figures in the street began to turn toward his apartment. One by one, their mouths stretched into wide, endless grins. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He pressed his hands against the glass, his voice barely a whisper. "Number no, no, no." The door behind him creaked open, and something stepped inside. The lights flickered. The whispers filled the room. Then, darkness. Ashwood Hollow had taken him for good. The town of Willow Creek had always felt strange to outsiders. The roads twisted in ways that didn't make sense. The fog clung too thickly to the trees, and the people never seemed quite right. For David Langley, it was just another town on his long drive home. A shortcut, the GPS had said. A road that would save him an hour of driving. The sun had already set, and the headlights of his car struggled against the dense mist rolling over the cracked pavement. His phone had no signal. The gas station he had passed an hour ago had been abandoned. And yet, the road stretched forward, endless. Then, something stepped onto the road. A figure thin, unmoving, watching. David slammed the brakes, his car screeching to a stop. His heart pounded as the figure stepped closer. A woman in a long, tattered dress, her hair hanging over her face. She didn't move like a person should. She glided. David's hands tightened on the wheel. The woman's head tilted, and then she vanished. The car's headlights flickered. The air inside the vehicle turned ice cold. A whisper crawled through the static on the radio. "Keep driving," David did. Willow Creek appeared out of nowhere, its streets lined with old Victorian homes and flickering streetlights. The town should have been quiet, but something felt off. People stood in doorways, their eyes following his car. Some were smiling, others weren't. David pulled up to a small motel, the only place that looked open. The neon sign buzzed weakly. Willow Creek Inn, vacancy. He checked in with an old woman whose eyes never blinked. "Room 6, she muttered, sliding him a key. "Can I get the Wi-Fi password?" David asked, trying to ignore the way she stared. The woman's lips parted into a grin that showed too many teeth. "There's no internet here." David's stomach twisted. Something moved behind her. A shadow in the dimly lit hallway. something too tall, too thin. David took the key and left quickly. Room 6 was small but clean. The bed was made. The air smelled faintly of dust and something older. The wallpaper was peeling in long curling strips, revealing something underneath. David set his bag down and locked the door. The moment he did, the radio turned on by itself. Static filled the room, deep and crackling. Then, a voice. "You shouldn't have stopped." David's breath caught in his throat. The bathroom door creaked open. The mirror inside was fogged over. But there was a message, written in something dark. "Leave now." A shadow moved in the reflection. Something was behind him. David turned too late. He woke up outside, lying on the cracked pavement in the middle of town. His car was gone. His bag was gone. The streets were empty. The air felt wrong. David stood, his breath fogging in the unnatural chill. The town was too silent. Then, the streetlights flickered, and the people came out of their houses, one by one. Their faces weren't right, too stretched, too hollow. They smiled in unison. "You belong here now," they whispered. David turned and ran. The forest at the edge of town was dense, suffocating. The trees moved when he wasn't looking. The path twisted in impossible ways, leading him back to the town again and again. No matter how far he ran, Willow Creek was waiting. Then the church bell rang, a deep, thundering sound that shook the ground. David turned toward it. It was coming from a church he had never seen before. The doors were open, and something inside was waiting. He stepped in. The church was empty, but the pews were filled with bodies, lifeless, their faces twisted in silent screams. And standing at the pulpit was the woman from the road. She lifted her hand. David's lungs seized. The air ripped from his body. The walls began to move. And then, she spoke. "We have been waiting for you." The door slammed shut. The candles flickered. And David Holloway was never seen again. The next morning, a new traveler arrived in Willow Creek. His car stopped outside the motel. The old woman at the front desk smiled. "Room 6, she said, and the cycle began again. David Holloway woke up, gasping for air. The world around him wasn't right. The last thing he remembered was the church, the woman at the pulpit, the lifeless bodies in the pews, the way the doors had slammed shut like the town had decided he was never leaving. Now, he was lying in a bed. Not his, not the motel, not anywhere he recognized. The walls were gray stone, damp with moisture. A single candle flickered on a wooden table beside him. The room smelled of mold, earth, and something dead. And then, he heard breathing, but it wasn't his. David sat up, pulse hammering. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted. Something was there, watching. The air was heavy, thick with something wrong. Then, a voice low, raspy, inhuman. "You shouldn't be awake." David turned, heart stopping. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, too thin, its limbs stretched unnaturally, its face hidden in the flickering candlelight. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. Then, slowly, its head tilted too far to the side, and it smiled. David ran. He didn't care where the door led, didn't stop to think. The corridor was narrow and endless, stone walls stretching into a suffocating tunnel. The air smelled of dirt and rot. The further he ran, the colder it got. Footsteps followed, not just his own. Something was behind him. Something was catching up. The candlelight flickered, then died. And in the darkness, David felt fingers curl around his ankle. A whisper slithered against his ear. "You never left." The darkness swallowed him. And then, David was somewhere else. He woke in the middle of Willow Creek. The streets were empty again. The town was still waiting. His car was parked exactly where he had left it. The motel's neon sign buzzed weakly, like nothing had ever happened. like he had never stepped into that church, like he had never died. David reached for his phone. No signal. He turned toward the forest. The trees shifted, and standing at the edge of the town were the people of Willow Creek, smiling, waiting. "You belong here," they whispered. David ran. This time, he didn't stop, didn't think, didn't look back. The highway should have been there. He had driven in from somewhere, but the road out of town was gone. The street stretched forever, looping back toward the town no matter which direction he ran. He drove. The gas gauge never moved. The road signs never changed. And every time he passed the gas station, the same woman stood outside it, smiling, waiting. David screamed, slammed his hands against the wheel. The radio flickered on. Static. And then, turn around. David drove until the sun should have risen, but the sky never changed. It remained gray, suffocating. He stopped outside the only building he hadn't entered yet. The library. The doors were already open. Inside, the bookshelves stretched impossibly high, their spines covered in dust and age. A dim light flickered in the center of the room, illuminating an old wooden desk. A woman sat there. She was not the same as the others. Her eyes weren't hollow. She wasn't smiling. She was waiting. "You're looking for answers," she said softly. David swallowed hard. "I want to know how to leave." The woman exhaled. "You don't." David clenched his jaw. "There has to be a way." She hesitated, then slid a book toward him. The cover was made of stitched leather, old and cracked. The title was etched in faded ink. "The History of Willow Creek." David opened it and froze. The pages told a story he already knew. A traveler, lost, stopping in Willow Creek for the night. A town that didn't exist on any map. A motel that never had any guests. A church that whispered to those who entered. And a man who tried to escape. David's stomach twisted as he flipped to the last page. His own name was written there. His own face was drawn. The text beneath it read, "David Holloway, last seen. Room 6, Willow Creek Inn." The ink was still wet. David's breath came in shallow gasps. "What is this?" The woman's expression darkened. "It's not a book, David." He looked back at the pages and saw the ink shifting. The words were changing. The story was still being written, and beneath his name, new words appeared. "You never left." The library lights flickered. The floor beneath him cracked open, and the whispers swallowed him whole. The next morning, the streets of Willow Creek were quiet. The townspeople went about their day. The motel's neon sign buzzed, and a new traveler pulled into town, checking into room 6, where a new story had already begun.
But by the time she reached Ravenwood, there was nothing left of him except his abandoned gear and the lingering stench of something rotten in the air. Rachel was different. She didn't just want to uncover the truth. She wanted to pull Nathan out of whatever nightmare had swallowed him whole. And if she had to go inside to do it, so be it. The asylum doors groaned open as she stepped inside. The light from her flashlight barely cut through the thick fog that seemed to drift inside the building, curling around the rusted wheelchairs, the peeling walls, the gurneys still stained with decades-old blood. The temperature dropped immediately. Her breath fogged before her. The silence was overwhelming, pressing against her ears like something alive. She had been in abandoned buildings before, But this was different. The walls felt like they were breathing. Then the whispers began. "You shouldn't have come." Rachel turned sharply, her heart hammering. The hallway stretched farther than it should have, its doors lined with flickering light. The peeling wallpaper had been replaced by something darker, something wet. And then she saw them. Fingers, dozens of them, stretching from the cracks in the walls, clawing at the air. A low moan echoed through the halls. Rachel stumbled back. Her flashlight flickered. A shadow moved at the end of the corridor. She aimed her camera, her fingers trembling. The lens glitched. The shadow twitched. It wasn't walking, it was crawling. Bones cracked as it twisted toward her, its limbs jerking unnaturally. And then, a face. Nathan. But his eyes were hollow, his mouth sewn shut with thick black thread. Rachel's breath hitched. "Run." Nathan's voice. Not from the figure, but from inside her head. The lights shattered. The figure lunged. Rachel ran. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the doors vanishing as soon as she passed them. The asylum wasn't letting her leave. Something was behind her. She felt it, heard it, the rasping breath, the sickening sound of something dragging against the floor, a presence heavy, looming just behind her. She reached the operating room. The walls pulsed, shifting like something was inside them, struggling to break free. The operating table sat waiting, covered in something dark, something fresh. And then, a voice. "Time for your procedure." Rachel turned. A figure loomed in the corner, clad in a decayed surgical gown, its eyes nothing but bleeding pits. The doctor, his scalpel glinted. Rachel's scream was swallowed by the walls. She didn't remember falling. She didn't remember the darkness. But when she woke, she was no longer in the asylum. She was somewhere worse. The floor beneath her was not wood, not tile, but flesh. It pulsed beneath her fingers. The air was thick, humid, smelling of rot and death. Figures moved in the distance. Shadows twisting, stretching. They were not human anymore. And among them, Nathan stood. He was smiling, but his eyes were gone. Rachel's body would not move. Then, the whispers returned. "Now it's your turn." The shadows closed in. The world shattered, and Rachel was never seen again. The next morning, Ravenwood stood silent. Nathan's camera lay in the dirt. Rachel's car was parked outside, its door still open. But there was no sign of her. Only the whispers remained. And a single new message on her phone, sent from her own number. "You never left."
A month after Daniel, Claire, Troy, Jessica, and Matt disappeared, the disappearances started again. People driving past Black Hollow reported seeing them. Matt, standing by the side of the road, his head tilted, empty eye sockets staring into the night. Claire, walking through the trees, her body thin and unnatural, her feet never touching the ground. Jessica, standing behind people in their rear-view mirrors, her mouth sewn shut, whispering something no one could understand. But the worst sighting was Daniel. He wasn't outside. He was inside the cars. People claimed that as they drove past the road, they could feel something sitting in their back seat. The temperature would drop. Their radio would turn to static. And if they dared to look in their mirror, they would see him. Daniel, his skin gray, his lips stitched, his eyes wide open but filled with nothing. And then the whisper would come, "Turn around." Some did, and they never made it home. Nathan Hale was a paranormal investigator. He had seen haunted houses, real-life exorcisms, and things no one should ever witness. But Black Hollow was different. It wasn't just haunted, it was alive. People had tried avoiding the road. It didn't matter. People had tried to burn down trees. The flames never caught. People had tried to remove the house. The workers disappeared before they could even set foot inside. So Nathan went in alone. The road stretched endlessly before him. The trees whispered as he passed. His GPS glitched, flickering between coordinates that didn't exist. His radio turned on by itself. Static filled the car. Then, through the distortion, he heard a voice. "Help me." Nathan gripped the wheel. "Who is this?" The voice crackled. "It's Daniel." The headlights flickered. The road was different now. The trees leaned toward him, the branches reaching. He could see the house. It was waiting. Nathan parked the car. He grabbed his camera, his flashlight, and his gun. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in evil. And this place? It was made of it. He stepped inside. The door swung shut behind him. The whispers began. Nathan moved slowly through the house. His flashlight beam trembled. The walls pulsed, the wallpaper breathing as he passed. He heard movement upstairs. Footsteps. Dragging. Something scraping against the wood. Then a voice. "Run." Nathan's breath caught. It was Claire. But it wasn't. He turned a corner and saw her. Or what was left of her. She stood in the hallway, her hair matted, her skin stretched too tight. Her fingers twitched, her neck bent at an impossible angle. And her mouth. It ripped open, the stitches snapping one by one. Her voice was not hers. "He is awake." The lights shattered. Nathan ran. The stairs stretched too long. The rooms changed. The walls moved. He wasn't in a house. He was in something else. He found a door. It was covered in handprints. Some human, some not. He opened it. The operating room stretched before him. A surgical table sat in the center, covered in something dark, something fresh. The walls were lined with tools, some rusted, some still dripping. And then, something shifted in the shadows. Nathan aimed his flashlight. Daniel was there, strapped to the table, eyes open, mouth sewn shut. But he was still alive. His fingers twitched. His chest rose and fell. Nathan stepped closer. "Daniel?" The stitches on his mouth ripped open, and he screamed. The walls collapsed. The shadows came alive. Nathan felt something grab his leg. He fired his gun. The bullet didn't do anything. A hand wrapped around his throat. Ice-cold fingers dug into his skin. Then he saw it. Not Daniel. Not Claire. Not Jessica. Something else. A face with no features. A body made of darkness. It smiled and whispered, "You're next." Nathan was dragged into the dark. They found his car 2 days later. The engine was still running. The driver's seat was empty. The only clue? A bloody note on the dashboard. 4 words. "Don't say his name." And his camera? Still recording. It only had one frame. A man sitting in the back seat, smiling. And behind him, the house, waiting.